story begins not in a courtroom, not in a lab, but in the cab of a farmer's pickup truck in Arkansas on a quiet October evening in 2016. Mike Wallace, a lifelong farmer, sat waiting just outside his fields. His thoughts were consumed not by harvest yields or weather forecasts, but by frustration. A second car approached, pulling up beside him. Seconds later, Wallace lay dead, murdered not over money or land, but over something far stranger, an herbicide. This wasn't just any chemical. This was a product so powerful, it had ignited feuds across rural America, dividing communities and even tearing families apart. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Rumors spread like wildfire. And all of it traced back to one company, a company whose grip on seeds, chemicals, and the very backbone of agriculture left farmers with no way out. By the early 2000s, this company controlled more than 80% of the seeds planted across the United States. They dictated the rules of farming with the stroke of a pen. If a farmer dared to plant seeds without paying them, lawsuits followed. If the wrong seeds appeared in a field, sometimes blown in by the wind, they sent investigators and in some cases destroyed entire livelihoods. This wasn't just competition. It was a monopoly enforced with contracts, patents, and private investigators knocking on farmers' doors. But how did we get here? How did the business of growing food, a practice as old as civilization itself, turn into a world where farmers could no longer legally save their own seeds, a tradition passed down for millennia? To answer that, we need to go back nearly a century to a chemist and a patch of poison ivy. In 1942, Franklin D. Jones was desperate. His children had developed severe rashes from poison ivy, and he wanted to eradicate the plant. He began spraying chemicals, hormones that controlled plant growth. Most attempts failed. Some even made the ivy grow faster. But then, something unexpected happened. The ivy turned red and shriveled, dying within days. The culprit was a compound known as 2,4-D. This discovery changed farming forever. For the first time, farmers had a tool that could selectively kill weeds without harming their crops. It was nothing short of revolutionary. Chemical companies raced to patent and produce new versions. Monsanto, a rising giant in the industry, saw an opportunity, and they grabbed it with both hands. But the pursuit of profit came with consequences. By the late 1940s, Monsanto's herbicide factories were booming. Then disaster struck. In Nitro, West Virginia, an explosion at one of their plants sent a dark cloud into the air. Workers soon fell ill, their skin erupting with painful lesions. Monsanto doctors couldn't explain the cause, but workers kept being exposed. Unknown to them, a toxic contaminant, dioxin, was forming during production, a chemical so dangerous that even in trace amounts, it could cause lasting damage to human health. As years passed, dioxin found its way into herbicides used worldwide. The most infamous example? Agent Orange. During the Vietnam War, millions of gallons of this herbicide, supplied largely by Monsanto, were sprayed across the jungle. The goal was to strip away cover for enemy forces. The result was devastation, cancers, birth defects, and suffering that continues to this day. The world began to ask questions. Regulators investigated. Scientists raised alarms. Monsanto's reputation was faltering. But then came a new product, glyphosate. Marketed as safe as table salt and biodegradable, it was sold under the brand name Roundup. farmers embraced it. It was powerful, effective, and promised to make weed control easier than ever. Roundup wasn't just a chemical, it was the beginning of a revolution in farming. Monsanto went further, engineering genetically modified seeds, Roundup-ready crops, that could survive heavy spraying of the herbicide. Farmers no longer had to worry about their crops dying alongside the weeds. But there was a catch. To use these seeds, they had to sign a contract. The terms were staggering. Farmers were forbidden from saving seeds for the next planting season, something humanity had done since the dawn of agriculture. They couldn't share seeds with neighbors. They couldn't even replant their own harvest. By simply opening a bag of seeds, they were legally bound to Monsanto's conditions. To enforce these rules, Monsanto employed investigators and private detectives. Stories spread of unmarked cars parked on rural roads, of farmers being photographed in their own fields. Some, like Indiana farmer Dave Runyon, were accused of patent infringement, despite never having signed Monsanto's agreements. Farmers described the feeling of living under constant surveillance, of never knowing if they would be accused of wrongdoing simply because pollen had drifted from a neighbor's field. It wasn't just about seeds. The contracts gave Monsanto sweeping rights to inspect fields, test crops, and take samples whenever they wished. If violations were found, farmers faced crushing lawsuits. Some settled quietly to avoid financial ruin. Others fought, but few could stand against a billion-dollar corporation with teams of lawyers. The ripple effect was enormous. When one farmer in a community adopted Monsanto's Roundup-ready seeds, neighbors often had no choice but to follow. If Roundup drifted across property lines, non-resistant crops would die. To protect themselves, farmers bought into the system. Before long, Monsanto didn't just dominate the seed market, they controlled the farming practices of nearly every major crop in America. And yet, this story is not only about one company. It is about power, about what happens when the tools of survival, seeds, the foundation of food itself, are patented, privatized, and placed behind legal barriers. For thousands of years, seeds were a shared inheritance of humanity. Farmers selected, saved, and replanted them, adapting crops to local conditions. But in a matter of decades, that age-old practice was transformed into a tightly controlled business model. Mike Wallace's murder in 2016 was not the direct act of Monsanto, but his death symbolized the toxic tensions that had been building for decades. Herbicides, monopolies, patents, these were no longer abstract concepts. They were forces shaping lives, communities, and even life and death conflicts. As investigations continue and lawsuits against glyphosate pile up, the world faces pressing questions. How much control should corporations have over the very seeds that grow our food? What happens when profit collides with survival? And most importantly, who gets to decide the future of farming? The farmers working the land, or the companies selling the seeds? The answers aren't simple, but one thing is clear. The story of seeds is no longer just about planting and harvesting. It's about power, law, and the right to feed ourselves.